Lyric World Conversations with Contemporary Poets, Poetry and Wonder is the name of a series of events happening in 2020 at Town Hall and curated by poet Shin Yu Pai. One poet featured in the series is Vashon Island's Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma, and we have them both here via video teleconference. A 2014 Stranger Genius Award nominee, Shin Yu Pai is the author of 8 books of poetry. Her works appeared in publications throughout the US, Japan, China, Taiwan, the UK, and Canada. Some of her poems have been commissioned by the Dallas Museum of Art, and she's been a featured presenter at national and international literary festivals, including the Geraldine Dodge Poetry Festival and the Montreal Zen Poetry Festival. Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma is a poet, magician, and musician based on Vashon Island, who brings together diverse practices in his creative expression. He touches upon the similarities between poetry, magic, and music to explore the boundaries and edges of what's visible and to gaze more deeply into the nature of wonder. Well, that'll be good to see you live up to it during this interview. I look forward to that. Shin Yu, tell us about how you got involved in developing this program for Town Hall.
Sure. So initially, it was a conversation that I started having with KUW, actually. So when Elizabeth Austin stepped down from doing poetry programming for the radio station, I approached them with the idea of wanting to do some sort of programming around poetry. And while they were not necessarily interested in continuing with the kind of work that Elizabeth had been doing for them related to poetry, they were interested in a live poetry event series, which I hadn't expected. So knowing that, I thought about the different curatorial partners I've worked with over the years and went back to Town Hall Seattle, who I had worked with in 2018 as an artist or curator in residence for them, where I built these interdisciplinary programs that were often related to looking at the arts and creativity in relationship to some of their larger subjects. So I had Peter Levitt in to talk about poetry and the everyday sacred. We had a program with artists and activists who talked about how creativity sort of innovates their work in activism around issues of homelessness. And I had a program also related to the writer in relationship to research in place and how that can sort of ground a practice. And so I've been building these programs in the past that had that quality of onstage conversation and a sort of deeper dive into craft. And I thought that is something that I could continue to extend in the work that I'd done with them before. So I began to sort of craft or put together this series idea, and it actually came out of originally also, I'd been putting together this programming proposal for the Seattle Asian Art Museum because they put out a call to basically reactivate the museum that's opening just in February 2020. And so as part of that overall proposal to reactivate the museum, there had been a literary series that I had built out with a number of AAPI poets in the region. And when that proposal didn't come together, I felt really strongly about wanting to be able to work with the poets and the writers who I had been thinking about for that series. So decided to sort of bring that over to Town Hall Seattle in a different context, where instead of just poetry readings that we would have done with Seattle Asian Art Museum, it sort of evolved into a series that could involve these onstage conversations that could look more closely at elements of craft and literary commitments in the work of these writers. So that's sort of the origin of the series.
Yeah, and when you use the moniker AAPI, you're talking about Asian American and Pacific Islander.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, and the series, this new series, asks the question, how can poetry expand our understanding of civic life? Now, first of all, I'm guessing that you think that, yes, it can have a positive effect. You wouldn't be a poet, you wouldn't be involved in this way. But you're in a society that largely doesn't share that feeling. I mean, we could give thousands of examples, but I think we can agree that that's pretty much the conventional wisdom, that the public, by and large, doesn't care about poetry. So can you answer the question in a brief way without stealing any of your thunder for the series?
Well, so one of the questions that I will ask as part of the series to each of the participants is the question of, what do you believe is the role of poetry and the role of poets in society? And I feel like that's an important question to ask. Some of the themes may be, I think, more obvious in how they may link up to civic life, like the program that Kun Won will offer in March related to displacement and notions of home, which may be a larger, sort of broader conversation related to larger issues here in Seattle related to displacement. But the other topics that I've sort of chosen, they are topics that are really meant to enrich and enliven conversation between people about what it is to be human in this world and in this time.
Wonderful. Thomas, tell us about how your work expands our understanding of civic life as you understand how it does that.
Well, that's a great question. And I'm just realizing I'm not appearing on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you just fine. And you don't appear when you're talking. You don't appear until you're talking, and then you appear to us, and we can see at the top. Yeah.
Great. The first thing that comes to mind is that I came to Tamil through. I came to poetry through Tamil, through the language of Tamil Nadu. And one of the things that really struck me about Tamil is how present the entire poetic tradition is in everyday life, including an entire tradition of public poetry, or poetry that addresses questions of politics, questions of ethics, questions of how the larger community or the larger community of communities gets along. And while I don't, the poems that I've written most recently don't, as a whole, focus on polity or on civic life, there are a couple. There are two things. One is that there's a kind of underlying concern with ethics, which is an underlying concern with how we get along with each other, both at the level of personal relationships and at the level of the larger relationships between communities of people. But also there are some poems that have come out of my practice and out of circumstances and opportunities that have presented themselves to me that are more directly related to civic life. One in particular is a poem called Here, which I wrote for the Vashon Heritage Museum. Last year they did an exhibit called Joy and Heartache about 125 years of Japanese American history on Vashon Island. And it traced sort of 5 historical periods in the unfolding of life on Vashon, focusing particularly on the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. And because, a historical exhibit can be informative but not necessarily engage the imagination, the curators wanted to have some way to enter into the deeper stories of the exhibit. And so they invited me to write a poem that appeared at the entrance of the exhibit as a kind of existential preparation, if you will, for experiencing the exhibit. So I wrote a poem which traced not only the experience of Japanese American on Vashon Island, but the relationship between the living and the dead, and the relationship between the original inhabitants of Vashon, what we now call Vashon, the Shabab people, the part of the Coast Salish peoples, and how the first internment, or the first incarceration began then in the 19th century with Europeans and other settlers coming to Cascadia, and how we see these patterns repeating through time, not only in our public life, but also in our hearts and in our dreams. And so as a poet, I'm interested in that intersection, the intersection of the inner world and the outer world, the heart and the community together, intertwined.
Fantastic. One of the things on the website says that you're going to discuss the ways that different languages alternately obscure or reveal truth. Living in a time that's been discussed or characterized as the post-truth era, the era of fake news. I mean, we kind of laugh at it, but we see in the impeachment proceedings that there are people repeating talking points that are patently false. You have CNN reporters saying, that's patently false. And then they can even play the proof of the president saying what they denied that he said. So, and I also think that your experience with the Tamil language is very helpful here, because coming in from at least a bilingual perspective, which is your practice, is very important, because you can see the differences between Tamil and English. So tell us about that notion about how different languages alternately obscure or reveal truth.
That's a big question, but as a start, I'd simply say that languages offer us ways to articulate our experience. And the more inarticulate our experience, or the more ineffable our experience, the more language has to reach towards poetry to express that experience. But even at the more straightforward, apparently factual level of our political discourse, our words and our metaphors deeply inform our perceptions. A very simple example, we talk about one of the phrases of the last 20 years or so is the war on drugs, which is such a kind of banal phrase, so bandied about that we don't necessarily think about it, but it's actually it's a metaphor that drugs is kind of like an enemy and we're waging a war on them. And this metaphor of war is so prevalent in our public language that we forget that it's a metaphor, and we forget all that the metaphor of war implies. So in a very different realm, for instance, in academia, you write a PhD dissertation and you have to defend your thesis. Well, there's the metaphor of war again, right? That we defend against attackers. We brace ourselves. We arm ourselves with arguments. And to the extent that we're not aware of how metaphors shape our perceptions, we're shaped by those metaphors. We're shaped by the metaphor of war. How different our public life would be if the metaphor wasn't one of war, but of conversation, or of communion, or of hospitality. So I'm interested as a poet and as a person and as a citizen in how, in the ways that we speak about our shared experience, and the ways that that our language can illuminate or show us new possibilities. Reopen our perceptions to new possibilities, or the way, conversely, they might just close us back down into some preordained path to war.
Right.
I want to say, too, that when Thomas and I were talking about what his talk could look like, the sort of arc of it, we also talked about language in the context of different practices like magic and music, and wonder if maybe you want to say something about that.
Sure. One of the things that I come to poetry interested in is how poetry allows us to touch the unseen or the invisible, because poetry isn't something we see. I mean, you might look at a poem on a page, but the poem on a page is really just a kind of it's akin to a sheet music, to a manuscript for a song. It tells you how the song would be performed, but it isn't the song. The song is the living thing that's in the air, that's embodied, that somebody might embody with their breath and their heart, and somebody might take in through their ears and also their heart. And so that, to me, is there's an interesting connection between that bringing of the unseen but hearable into our experience, and the way an art like stage magic or theater more generally brings into our visual experience, it embodies an experience which also might be at its heart invisible, might also at its heart have to do with the unseen worlds that we move in all the time, perhaps not realizing that we do.
Thomas, we have the benefit of video here, and I didn't ask you before we started, but Is there any maybe small magic trick that you can do now to give us a sense of to illustrate what you're talking about with magic?
Um, I'm away from home at the moment. I don't really have at easy access anything that might be useful for that.
Okay. Well, fair enough. I probably should have asked that before we started. Shin Yi, you talked about how this was developed for the Seattle Asian Art Museum, which is reopening after the remodeling, and I'd like to ask you. You have Thomas here, Hitoshi, Pruiksma. You have Kun Woon, so you have people of Asian descent as part of this. Tell us why it's important that we be exposed to poets of Asian descent.
Sure, and Prageeta Sharma, who's of Southeast Asian descent, is the third presenter in June. She's fabulous. She'll be presenting with Afro's Fatima Ahmed as her onstage interviewer. And I'll also mention that Paul Kikuchi is going to be playing for the Kun Woon program. He's a fabulous Japanese-American mixed-race percussionist and has done a lot of work related to the Japanese-American internment with his own sort of research and practice. So I'm really excited to sort of curate him with that theme of displacement and home. So why is it important to feature underrepresented voices? So I very intentionally chose poets who have never had the opportunity to share their work with town hall audiences before, and sort of who I consider to be sort of hometown locals who maybe haven't had the light shined on their work, Thomas being in Vashon, Kun Woon being an older poet now in his 70s who resided for many decades in the International District and then eventually got displaced to West Seattle. He has been praised by Lawrence Ferlinghetti for the innovation of his verse and is a publisher and is such a great community builder here in Seattle. Prageeta maintains loose connections here to Seattle. She has a home here while teaching elsewhere, but is published by Wave Books here in Seattle. So that sort of connection to the local was very important to me, but also uplifting Asian American voices. I think there's been a lot of evolution in my own curatorial practice as somebody who produces cultural and public programs. And for many years, I had sort of gone where my interests sort of drew me or directed me. And in this way, I wasn't always very intentional about being more inclusive about underrepresented voices. And as I've matured in my career and reflected, I have been so lucky over the years to have doors opened for me as an Asian American female poet. And I think now, as I enter my mid-career and become more of a mentor or a teacher or somebody who has cultural influence and has the ability to curate these programs, that it's very important that I recognize that power and influence that I have to uplift voices that would otherwise not be heard.
Excellent. Tell us what you hope people attending the series will get out of it.
Well, I hope that they will open their eyes to the role of poetry and what it can be in everyday life in a different way. The real intention of the series is to bring poetry to new audiences in a way that can make it more relevant to their lives, and therefore the onstage conversation, also having a musical component that can help sort of bridge the different sections of these programs, but also reflect on the different themes. So, I hope that people will come together, be together, open their hearts and minds to hearing work and voices that maybe they may not have been familiar with, and to contemplate these themes deeply with us, whether it's poetry and wonder or magic, or poetry and its utility in healing and grieving and grief. I feel like poetry is this tremendous tool to have really heart-to-heart conversations.
Thomas, do you want to take us out with one of your poems?
Sure. Here's the little poem that occurred to me to share as we were talking. It's from my most recent book called The Safety of Edges, and the poem is named Hushed. In the library, the young girl, her mother checking email, sang a little song she was making in the moment. It wasn't being sung for her mother or herself. It wasn't being sung for anyone around her. It was only being sung for the sake of being sung. Her heart and mouth moving in the movement of the song. And I knew who she was beyond what I knew. She was me as a child, singing to be singing, and I knew that her mother in the library would stop her, would tell her to be quiet. How could she not? But oh, for the singing that seeks no applause and is ours, even in the silence.
You read that at Elliott Bay at your launch, and I love that poem.
Thank you.
That's so beautiful. What a great way to end it. I'm really grateful for the work that you both do for poetry and in this community. And, I know that you do it because you're compelled to do it. You have been called by poetry to do that, but we benefit from that deep calling, and I'm very grateful for your work. Thank you, and I wish you much success.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.